Right now, as you're listening, there's something extraordinary happening in your genetic code. If you have blue eyes, you're carrying a mutation that traces back to a single person who lived in the frozen landscapes of Ice Age Europe. Every blue-eyed human on Earth today, from Stockholm to San Francisco, carries this same genetic signature. And here's what gets me every time I think about it. That mutation didn't give us an advantage for survival. It didn't help us hunt better or see further or handle the cold more efficiently. If anything, blue eyes make you more vulnerable to UV damage and bright light. And yet somehow, impossibly, this trait spread from one person to millions across an entire continent in just a few thousand years. That's lightning speed in evolutionary terms. We're talking about explosive growth that defied all the rules of gradual evolution that scientists expected. When you look at how traits normally spread through populations, it's supposed to be slow, incremental, generations upon generations of slight advantages accumulating until something becomes common. But blue eyes didn't work like that. They exploded across Europe like a wildfire. Within just a few thousand years, a genetic variant that existed in one individual transformed the appearance of millions. Scientists have been trying to solve this mystery for decades, and the answers reveal something profound about human evolution, sexual selection, and the very nature of how populations change. The story forces us to completely reconsider our assumptions about how quickly humans can evolve and how powerful the forces of attraction can be in shaping our species. But before we dive into that, if you're using this video to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. Please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I check the comments and it's fascinating seeing people from everywhere, all wondering about the same mysteries, all trying to understand where we came from. Here's what makes the blue eyes mystery so compelling. We have actual evidence. Ancient DNA from people who lived thousands of years ago, genetic sequences that have been preserved in bone fragments and archaeological remains. In 2006, scientists examining a 7,000-year-old skeleton found in a Spanish cave made a discovery that shattered conventional wisdom. They extracted DNA and determined that this person, called L.A. Brana, had blue eyes. And when they looked at the other genes, the ones controlling skin color, they found something that should have been impossible. This individual had the genetic signature for dark, almost African-like skin pigmentation. The researchers initially thought they had made an error because the combination seemed so improbable. But as more ancient DNA became available from archaeological sites across Europe, the pattern held. Early Europeans with blue eyes consistently showed genetic signatures for dark skin and dark hair. Picture this for a moment. Someone with piercing blue eyes and dark skin. The combination seems impossible by today's standards. You wouldn't see that combination in any modern population. But 7,000 years ago, that was actually the norm across much of Europe. A person with the deep blue eyes of a Scandinavian combined with the skin tone of someone from sub-Saharan Africa. That image shatters everything we thought we knew about how European physical traits evolved together. For decades, scientists assumed that blue eyes, light skin, and blonde hair all evolved together as a package deal. Natural selection favouring light pigmentation in northern climates where sunlight is limited and vitamin D synthesis becomes crucial. Light skin, light hair, light eyes all on the same evolutionary pathway. It made sense logically. They should have evolved together. But the ancient DNA shattered that assumption completely. Blue eyes came first, spreading explosively through dark-skinned hunter-gatherer populations tens of thousands of years before light skin became common. These traits had completely separate evolutionary histories driven by different selective pressures. Blue eyes evolved through one mechanism, light skin evolved through another, and blonde hair represents yet another independent pathway entirely. What we see today in Northern European populations isn't the result of one coordinated evolutionary change. It's the result of three separate genetic revolutions that happened at different times for different reasons and eventually converged in the same populations through the complex dance of migration and mixing that has defined human history. So how did a single random mutation in one person's iris lead to one of the most successful genetic takeovers in human history? The answer lies in understanding what blue eyes actually are and why evolution seems to favour them despite their disadvantages. When light hits a blue eye, it doesn't encounter blue pigment because there is no blue pigment. That's the first misconception we need to clear up. Blue eyes don't contain any blue dye or blue molecules whatsoever. Instead, they're the result of a genetic glitch that prevents the normal production of melanin in the iris. Melanin is the pigment that makes brown eyes brown, the same pigment that darkens skin and hair. But when melanin production fails in the iris, something fascinating happens. Light scatters and bounces around inside the eye in specific ways. Only certain wavelengths make it back out to our visual system. Those wavelengths appear blue to us. It's the exact same physical phenomenon that makes the sky appear blue. Light scattering through particles in the atmosphere, except in this case the scattering is happening in the microscopic structures of your iris. Blue eyes are essentially tiny optical illusions created by the absence of pigment. And here's what's remarkable. That absence doesn't happen uniformly. Different people's eyes scatter light slightly differently, which is why some blue eyes appear almost grey, while others look brilliant sapphire. Some have hints of green or violet. The specific shade depends on the exact density of collagen fibers and protein structures in the iris. These minute variations create the full spectrum of blue shades we observe in different individuals. This absence of pigment is controlled by genes on chromosome 15. The primary gene is called OCA2, which produces a protein responsible for melanin production. But there's a second gene called HERC2 that acts like a switch, turning OCA2 on and off as needed. The mutation that causes blue eyes affects this switch mechanism. When HERC2 doesn't function properly, it can't activate OCA2 effectively. Without sufficient OCA2 activity, melanin production drops dramatically. And without melanin, you get blue eyes. But here's what makes this mutation so remarkable from an evolutionary perspective. It provides no obvious survival advantage. Brown eyes are simply better designed for most environments. They protect against sun damage, reduce glare, provide better visual performance in bright conditions. Blue eyes are essentially a genetic luxury with real costs. People with blue eyes are more sensitive to bright light. They're more vulnerable to certain types of UV damage. They have higher rates of some eye conditions. From a pure survival standpoint, brown eyes win every time. So why did they spread so rapidly? The answer lies in one of the most powerful forces in evolution, not natural selection, where traits spread because they help organisms survive, but sexual selection, where traits spread because they make organisms more attractive to potential mates. Blue eyes became one of the most successful examples of runaway sexual selection in human evolutionary history. They spread not because they helped people survive, but because people found them irresistibly attractive. Think about your own reaction to blue eyes. There's something captivating about them, something that draws attention and holds it. That's not cultural conditioning or learned preference. That's a deep-seated biological response that appears to be hardwired into human psychology. We're naturally drawn to novelty, to things that stand out from the background. In a world where brown eyes were the overwhelming norm, blue eyes would have been absolutely impossible to ignore. But the attraction goes deeper than simple novelty. Blue eyes may have become linked to perceptions of youth, health, and fertility. Because melanin production increases with age and sun exposure, lighter eyes could have been interpreted as signals of genetic quality or reproductive potential. This connection between eye colour and perceived health status could have been particularly important in ancient societies where assessing a potential mate's fitness was difficult. You couldn't run genetic tests. You couldn't examine medical records. But you could look at someone's eyes and make instant judgments about their health and vitality. Studies show that even today, people often perceive blue-eyed individuals as more trustworthy, more innocent, or more emotionally expressive. These perceptions could have translated into social and reproductive advantages that drove the rapid spread of the trait through ancient populations. The mathematics of sexual selection can create explosive population changes under the right conditions. If blue-eyed individuals consistently attracted more mates and produced more offspring than brown-eyed individuals, even by small margins, the trait would spread exponentially through the population. We're not talking about large advantages. Small preferences compound over generations and eventually produce dramatic changes. And once a certain threshold was reached, the process could become self-reinforcing. As blue eyes became more common, they might have become even more attractive, creating a feedback loop that accelerated their spread even further. Rarity becomes exotic. Exotic becomes desirable. Desirable becomes dominant. It's a vicious cycle in evolutionary terms. But here's where the genetic evidence reveals something even more astonishing. The spread of blue eyes wasn't gradual or uniform across Europe. It happened in what geneticists call a selective sweep, where beneficial mutations spread through populations at near maximum theoretical speeds. We're talking about explosive growth happening in just a few hundred generations, a trait going from appearing in one individual to dominating entire continental populations. The genetic signatures are so consistent that researchers can use them as molecular markers to trace exactly how this spread happened, mapping the routes and timing of ancient human migrations with remarkable precision. The earliest evidence for blue eyes comes from ancient DNA extracted from a hunter-gatherer who lived in Crimea around 35,000 years ago. But this individual, like other early blue-eyed Europeans, had dark skin and dark hair. These early hunter-gatherers, known as Western hunter-gatherers, carried the blue-eye mutation across much of Ice Age Europe. DNA evidence shows they had established populations from Spain to Siberia, and many of them possessed the genetic variants for blue eyes. During this period, blue eyes reached their highest frequencies in European populations. Some ancient groups show blue eye rates approaching 100%. These were thriving populations with sophisticated cultures. They created cave paintings of remarkable artistry. They developed specialized tools for hunting in extreme cold. They maintained extensive trade networks connecting distant groups. They were at the peak of hunter-gatherer success, and many of them had blue eyes. It was a world where blue eyes dominated, even though the people carrying them looked dramatically different from the modern Europeans we might imagine. But then everything changed. Around 8,000 years ago, a new wave of migrants arrived in Europe. These were Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, who brought agriculture and a completely different genetic profile. These farmers had brown eyes, brown hair, and somewhat lighter skin than the hunter-gatherers they encountered. The arrival of these farming populations triggered a massive demographic transformation. In many regions, they largely replaced the existing hunter-gatherer groups, not through conquest necessarily, though some conflict likely occurred. Farming populations simply had larger families. Agriculture could support more people per square kilometre than hunting and gathering, so farming populations grew faster, expanded faster, and genetically overwhelmed the existing populations over the course of centuries. And because the farmers carried brown eye genes, blue eye frequencies plummeted across much of Europe. For thousands of years, brown eyes dominated European populations as farming spread, and hunter-gatherer populations declined. The genetic signatures of blue eyes didn't disappear entirely, but they became much rarer than they had been during the height of the hunter-gatherer period. It's like the mutation almost went extinct, preserved only as recessive genes hidden in the population, waiting for circumstances to change again. These hidden genetic variants persisted silently through thousands of years of farming societies, buried in the DNA of people whose eyes appeared brown but who carried the invisible blueprint for blue. Then came another wave of change. Around 4,500 years ago, pastoralist groups from the Eurasian steppes began migrating into Europe. These Bronze Age populations brought new technologies, new social structures, and yet another genetic profile that would reshape European populations. They brought horses, they brought new weapons and warfare tactics. They brought a different language family that would eventually dominate European languages, and many of them carried the genetic variants for blue eyes, though some had come from regions where brown eyes were common. But something remarkable happened during this period. Blue eye frequencies began to recover and eventually exceeded their original hunter-gatherer levels. This is the truly astonishing part. Through some combination of genetic drift, population mixing and continued sexual selection, blue eyes made a comeback that was even more dramatic than their original spread. Recessive genes that had been hidden for thousands of years suddenly re-emerged in populations, and they spread rapidly, faster than they had initially spread among the hunter-gatherers. In some northern European regions, blue eyes became so common they approached fixation, meaning nearly everyone in the population carried them. Why this resurgence occurred remains something of a mystery. Maybe the Bronze Age migration introduced new cultural preferences that favoured blue eyes. Maybe the demographic circumstances were ideal for a sexual selection sweep. Maybe blue eyes became associated with the new dominant populations and became symbols of status or culture. Identity, we don't know for certain. The genetic evidence tells us it happened, but the specific mechanisms remain obscure, hidden in the complexity of social dynamics and individual preferences that don't leave obvious traces in the archaeological record. This complex demographic history explains why blue eyes show such strong geographic patterns across modern Europe today. The highest frequencies are found in northern regions like Scandinavia and the Baltic states, where hunter-gatherer ancestry remained strong and Bronze Age populations mixed extensively with existing populations. Moving south and east across Europe, blue eye frequencies decline in patterns that reflect the layered history of population movements and mixing that shape the continent. Estonia leads the world with nearly 90% blue-eyed populations. Finland, Iceland, and other northern regions show similarly extreme frequencies. Mediterranean populations show much lower rates reflecting stronger genetic contributions from Neolithic farmers and subsequent migrations from southern regions. But even these patterns aren't simple, and the complexity reveals something profound about human evolution. Physical traits don't spread through populations in isolation from cultural, environmental and historical factors. Their success depends on complex interactions between genetics, social dynamics, environmental pressures, and demographic circumstances that can change rapidly and unpredictably. Modern genetic studies continue to reveal new layers of complexity. What initially appeared to be controlled by one or two genes now involves interactions between more than 16 different genetic regions. This genetic complexity helps explain why eye color inheritance patterns often seem unpredictable. Two brown-eyed parents can have blue-eyed children. Two blue-eyed parents occasionally have brown-eyed children. The simple dominant recessive model taught in basic genetics classes captures only pair, RT, of the real picture. Modern genome-wide studies have identified dozens of genetic variants that influence eye color in subtle ways. Some affect melanin production directly at the biochemical level. Others modify how melanin is distributed within the iris after it's been produced. Still others influence the structural properties of eye tissues that affect light scattering and the ultimate appearance of the iris. Some variants even affect the development of the iris during fetal development. This polygenic architecture means that eye color exists on a continuum rather than in discrete categories. Green eyes, hazel eyes, grey eyes, and various shades of blue and brown all reflect different combinations of these genetic influences. Rather than simple categories, eye color is the result of dozens of tiny genetic switches all contributing small amounts to the final result. This is why two people with apparently the same eye color can actually have different underlying genetics. This is why identical twins can show subtle variations in eye shade. This is why environmental factors like lighting can make someone's eyes appear to change color slightly. But despite this complexity, the core story remains clear. The vast majority of blue eyes in European populations trace back to that single ancestral mutation that occurred thousands of years ago. The genetic signatures are so consistent that scientists can use them as molecular markers to trace population movements and mixing patterns across prehistoric Europe with remarkable precision. When they analyze modern populations, they can actually determine which people are more closely related to ancient populations in different regions. Every blue-eyed person alive today can trace their ancestry back to that original mutation, connecting them across continents and across millennia. This CR eats what we mentioned earlier, a hidden population structure that cuts across all traditional ethnic and geographic boundaries. Recent discoveries continue to push back the timeline of when this mutation first appeared and revealing new details about how it spread. Scientists have identified the specific geographic region where the ancestral mutation likely originated, somewhere around the Black Sea region, perhaps in what's now Ukraine or the Caucasus Mountains. This region was a crossroads of human populations during the Ice Age, a place where different groups mixed and exchanged genes and ideas. From this origin point, the mutation spread across Europe through the migration and mixing of hunter-gatherer populations. The spread wasn't uniform or predictable. Different regions received the mutation at different times through different routes of contact. But once it arrived, it took hold with remarkable speed. By analyzing ancient DNA from hundreds of archaeological sites, researchers can now map this spread with remarkable precision, tracking how blue eyes moved across the continent over thousands of years. They can see the pattern of expansion, the waves of migration, the moments when populations mixed and exchanged genetic material. It's like reading a map written in genes, a molecular record of human movement and change. Think about what this means for the people who carried this mutation. The first blue-eyed individual, whoever they were, didn't know they were about to change the course of human evolution. They had no idea that their eyes would become the template for millions of descendants across an entire continent. They were simply surviving in one of the harshest environments humans have ever inhabited. The last glacial maximum, when ice sheets reached their greatest extent and temperatures dropped to levels that would challenge even modern survival technology. Much of Europe was uninhabitable tundra. The few human populations that survived were concentrated in small refuges scattered across the southern margins of the continent. These people were sophisticated, though. They created advanced toolkits specifically designed for Arctic conditions: bone harpoons, stone blay, specialized spear throwers that increased hunting accuracy and range. They developed specialized hunting weapons, cold-weather clothing, and shelter construction techniques that would have impressed modern survival experts. They created cave art that rivals anything produced by later civilizations. The paintings at Chauvet show lions and horses with dynamic movement and anatomical accuracy. These weren't crude stick figures. These were sophisticated artistic expressions by people who understood visual representation and aesthetic beauty. They lived in complex societies with extensive trade networks. Shells from the Mediterranean have been found in archaeological sites thousands of miles away. Amber from the Baltic appears in sites in Spain. This wasn't random wandering. This was organized trade and exchange. And somewhere in this world of ice and adaptation, someone was born with blue eyes. Within just a few thousand years, this person's genetic legacy had transformed entire populations. Within just a few millennia, a striking feature that had appeared in one individual had become a defining characteristic of entire continents. Here's something that should genuinely astonish you. When scientists analyze the DNA of any blue-eyed person today, they can identify the exact chromosomal segments that came from that original Ice Age ancestor. These aren't vague genetic similarities. These are identical molecular sequences that have been passed down through an unbroken chain spanning 35,000 years. If you have blue eyes, approximately 2% of your entire genome consists of DNA that was physically present in that single hunter-gatherer who lived during the last glacial maximum. You're carrying actual molecular fragments from someone who witnessed the world when woolly mammoths dominated the landscape and ice sheets covered most of northern Europe. This level of genetic preservation is almost unprecedented in human evolution. Most traits show tremendous variation and recombination over such vast timescales. But the blue eye region of chromosome 15 has remained remarkably intact, creating a genetic time capsule that preserves ancient human DNA in pristine condition. Scientists call this phenomenon linkage disequilibrium, where chunks of chromosome remain together because they haven't had sufficient time or opportunity to break apart through genetic recombination. The blue eye mutation essentially hitchhiked with surrounding genetic material, dragging along DNA sequences that have nothing to do with eye color, but happen to be nearby on the chromosome. This genetic hitchhiking effect means that blue-eyed people share ancestry at numerous locations throughout their genome, not just at the eye color genes. They form a hidden population within European populations, united by their descent from that ancient founder individual, regardless of their apparent ethnic or geographic origins. The story becomes even more intriguing when we consider that blue eyes didn't just spread through random chance or simple sexual selection. Recent research suggests there may have been specific environmental advantages to having blue eyes in certain northern European conditions. The reduced melanin in blue eyes affects how they process light in ways that could have been beneficial in the low-light environments of northern winters. Blue eyes scatter more light within the iris, potentially improving visual sensitivity in dim conditions. Someone with blue eyes might have been able to see slightly better during the long twilight periods of northern latitudes, giving them advantages in hunting and navigation. They also affect the production of certain hormones that regulate sleep and mood cycle. See, blue-eyed individuals might show different patterns of melatonin production and circadian rhythm regulation compared to brown-eyed individuals. Some scientists have proposed that blue eyes provided psychological advantages in environments with long, dark winters. The increased light scattering might have helped suppress melatonin production, reducing seasonal depression and maintaining alertness during periods of limited sunlight. If blue-eyed individuals experienced less seasonal affective disorder or maintained higher alertness during dark winters, this could have provided real survival advantages beyond just attractiveness. These potential advantages wouldn't have been dramatic enough to drive the initial spread of blue eyes through sexual selection alone, but they might have provided subtle benefits that helped maintain high blue frequencies in northern populations once the trait became established. Environmental factors and sexual selection might have worked together, reinforcing each other in northern latitudes, while natural selection against blue eyes might have been stronger in southern regions with more intense sunlight, where protection from UV damage became more critical. This combination of multiple selective pressures might help explain why blue eyes show such a striking concentration in northern European populations today. But here's what makes this story even more extraordinary. It reveals that human evolution didn't stop when we left Africa or built our first cities. We're still changing. The genetic changes that created modern European appearance happened within the time frame of human civilization. People were building the first cities, developing agriculture, creating art and writing systems while their physical appearance was still evolving in real time. Some of the most recent genetic changes in European populations happened so late that they overlapped with historical periods we can study through written records and archaeological evidence. The final waves of genetic mixing that created modern European populations were still happening when the pyramids were being built, when Greek philosophers were developing mathematics, when Roman legions were conquering the Mediterranean. This ongoing evolution challenges our assumptions about human genetics, Saint. We imagine that our ancestors from a few thousand years ago looked essentially like us, just with different clothing and technology. But in many cases they would have appeared strikingly different, carrying combinations of physical traits that no longer exist in modern populations. Blue eyes with dark skin would have been common. Light skin with brown eyes would have been unusual. The stereotypical blue-eyed, blonde-haired Scandinavian is actually a very recent combination, a historical accident rather than an ancient genetic destiny. So here we are at the end of our journey through the mystery of blue eyes, and you might think we've solved it, that we understand exactly how a random mutation became one of the most successful genetic takeovers in human history. But in many ways the deeper mysteries remain. We know the genetics. We understand the mechanisms of sexual selection. We can trace the spread across continents using ancient DNA. But we still can't fully explain why blue eyes are so universally attractive. Is there something fundamental about contrasting eye colours that triggers a biological response? Is it purely cultural learning that gets embedded in our brains from childhood? Is it linked to health markers that our brains recognise subconsciously? We don't know. We can measure that people are attracted to blue eyes. We can document that this attraction varies somewhat across cultures, but explaining the mechanism remains frustratingly difficult. We can't perfectly predict how traits will spread through future populations. We can't say with certainty what other genetic innovations might emerge in our species in the coming millennia. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the incomplete understanding is part of what makes this story so fascinating. Every year, new research reveals deeper layers of complexity. New ancient DNA samples push back the timeline further. New genetic studies identify genes we didn't know were involved. Each discovery changes the story slightly, refines it, adds nuance. This is how science works, not with final answers and closed books, but with ongoing investigation and willingness to revise our understanding as evidence accumulates. The scientific process is humble. It acknowledges uncertainty. It builds incrementally, and it remains open to surprise. The blue-eyed mutation reminds us that we're not separate from evolution or above it. We're still part of it. We like to imagine that we've transcended biology, that technology and culture have insulated us from the ancient forces that shaped our species, but that's an illusion. Every generation, every choice about who we find attractive, every demographic shift and cultural change, it's all potentially shaping the genetic future of our species. Blue eyes demonstrate how quickly human populations can change when powerful selective pressures operate on traits that affect mate choice and social perception. What started as a single random mutation in one individual became a defining characteristic of millions of people within just a few millennia. Other mutations could potentially do the same thing under different circumstances. Climate change is creating new environmental pressures. Technological environments are shifting how we interact and mate. Global migration patterns are mixing populations in unprecedented ways. These are all novel, selective pressures that will influence human evolution in ways we can't yet predict. Understanding how blue eyes evolved gives us a template for recognizing and studying these ongoing evolutionary processes. The piercing blue eyes that captivate us today carry within them the genetic memory of that extraordinary evolutionary journey. From a single mutation in one Ice Age hunter-gatherer to a defining characteristic of millions of modern Europeans, blue eyes represent the extraordinary power of evolution to transform human populations in ways that continue to shape our world. Every time you look into someone's blue eyes, you're witnessing the culmination of 35,000 years of human history. You're seeing proof that impossible things can happen in evolution when the right conditions align. You're looking at a trait that shouldn't exist in the numbers it does, shouldn't have spread so rapidly, shouldn't have survived its own medical disadvantages, and yet it did. And if it happened once, it can happen again. The same forces that created blue eyes are still operating, still shaping our species, still writing new chapters in the ongoing story of human evolution. Maybe the next dramatic change will be something we can't even imagine yet. Maybe in 10,000 years, our descendants will look back at us and be amazed by some trait we carry that will have transformed the human species in unexpected ways. Maybe it's already beginning. So get comfortable and let these genetic mysteries follow you into your dreams. Because somewhere in the frozen landscapes of Ice Age Europe, an ancestor you've never met passed along a genetic gift that still travels through your body today. You're carrying DNA that was present when woolly mammoths dominated the landscape and ice sheets covered most of northern Europe. You're connected to that ancient individual through an unbroken chain spanning 35,000 years. And that gift, those blue eyes or the blue-eye genes hidden somewhere in your genome, they remind us that we're all connected, all shaped by the remarkable and ongoing process of evolution. We're all part of the same story, the same great arc of human change and adaptation that began hundreds of thousands of years ago and will continue long after we're gone. The blue eyes that captivate us are just one chapter in that story, but they're an extraordinary chapter. If you want to really understand how something like blue eyes can sweep through a continent, you have to stop imagining ancient Europe as a crowded place. You have to forget modern population maps, forget cities, forget borders, Forget the idea that Europe was a continuous human landscape filled with millions of people. For most of the last 40,000 years, Europe was empty in a way that is almost hard to picture. It was cold, it was vast, it was dangerous, and humans were rare. During the height of the last ice age, when the glaciers were at their maximum extent, the total human population of all Europe might have been smaller than a single modern city. Not a big city, a medium one, or maybe even less. Tens of thousands, maybe fewer. Small bands of people scattered across the southern fringes of the continent, clustered in pockets where survival was possible. Iberia, southern France, the Italian peninsula, the Balkans, the Black Sea region. These places acted like refuges, sheltered zones where game animals persisted, where plants could still grow, where rivers still ran, where the cold was brutal but not absolute. If you shrink the population enough, evolution stops looking like the slow, gradual process we imagine. It becomes fast, violent, unpredictable. Because when there are only a few hundred or a few thousand people in an entire region, random chance has power. In genetics, there's a concept that sounds almost too simple to explain something this dramatic. Genetic drift. It's not selection. It's not advantage. It's not this trait helps you survive. Drift is just probability. It's the fact that when populations are small, which genes get passed on can depend on who happens to have children, who survives a winter, who dies in a hunting accident, who gets sick, who finds a mate, who doesn't. In a population of 10 million, drift is a whisper. In a population of 1,000, drift is a shout. And Ice Age Europe was a place where drift could dominate reality. Now add another concept, founder effect. Imagine a group of 30 people leaving one refuge valley and walking north as the ice retreats. They find a new hunting ground. They settle. They have children. Their children have children. Within a few centuries, that one group becomes hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Entire regions can be repopulated by the descendants of a tiny founding band. Whatever genes those founders carried become overrepresented in the future population, not because they were better, but because they were early. And that's the part people forget. Timing is a selection pressure all its own. If the first group to recolonize a region happens to have a high frequency of a certain trait, that trait can become common across vast territory simply because it was there at the beginning of the expansion. Like ink spilled on paper, it spreads because it's already wet, already moving. Blue eyes may have ridden those expansion waves, not as a lone mutation crawling slowly through huge populations, but as a feature present in a small group that became disproportionately ancestral to later Europeans. This is why the single ancestor idea persists, not because it is literally one person in the simplest sense, but because the mutation likely emerged in a very small population where everyone was closely related, and from that small population, the genetic signature spread outward as descendants expanded. It's one of the strangest truths of evolution. Sometimes the fate of millions is shaped by what happened in a group small enough to fit around a campfire. And there's another reason this matters, because it changes the emotional tone of the story. It means blue eyes didn't need to be an incredible advantage. They only needed to exist in the right people at the right time, in the right place, when Europe was being repopulated like a blank canvas after the ice. Picture the landscape, ice sheets to the north like white walls, rivers braided across tundra plains, herds of reindeer moving like dark smoke across the horizon, and somewhere in a refuge zone, maybe near the Black Sea, maybe in the valleys north of the Caucasus, someone is born with the eyes that look wrong by the standards of their world. Not brown, not dark, but pale, reflective, strange. The first time someone sees those eyes in firelight, it would have been unmistakable, because in a small band, you know everyone's face, every expression, every detail. And when something new appears, it doesn't get lost in a crowd. It becomes a story. It becomes a signal. It becomes something people talk about, even if they don't have the words we have now, even if they can't articulate mutation or genetics or HERC2. They would have felt it, though. The novelty. Humans are pattern recognition machines. We notice deviation, we notice rarity, we notice contrast, and we attach meaning to what we notice. That might be the oldest engine of sexual selection in our species. Not blue eyes are better, but blue eyes are different. And difference, in a world where most things are the same, can become power. But this story isn't only about drift and founders and attraction. It's also about the fact that human history is not a straight line. It's a series of waves that crash into each other, recede, and crash again. Populations expanding and shrinking, mixing and separating, being replaced, and then returning as hidden ancestry. Europe especially is not one lineage. It's genetic palimpsest. Layers written over layers. Faint traces still visible if you know where to look. For a long time, scientists told a simple story. Humans left Africa, entered Europe, evolved lighter skin and eyes to adapt to low sunlight, and became the Europeans we know today. Ancient DNA shattered that story, not because it replaced it with a new simple story, but because it revealed how chaotic the real process was. The first great European layer we can trace clearly is what geneticists call Western hunter-gatherers. Not because they were Western in a political sense, but because their genetic signature dominates ancient samples from Western and Central Europe after the Ice Age. These were the people who survived in refuge and then expanded north as the glaciers retreated. Their cultures include the great cave painters, the tool makers who shaped flint into blades so sharp they could slice hide like paper, the people who hunted aurochs and wild horses, who navigated rivers and forests with an intimacy we can barely imagine. Their DNA tells us something that feels almost like a twist in a thriller. They were likely darker skinned than later Europeans, but many carried the blue eye variant. This combination existed because skin pigmentation and eye color are controlled by different genetic mechanisms, shaped by different pressures. Skin color is heavily influenced by UV exposure and vitamin D needs. Eye color, especially the blue eye variant, seems driven more by drift and sexual selection, possibly with small environmental influences. The fact that these traits evolved separately means the human face we consider normal today is a historical coincidence, a convergence that didn't exist for most of human time. Then came the second layer, the farmers. Around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, something happened that was, in its own way, more disruptive than an ice age. People in Anatolia and the Near East had developed agriculture, wheat, barley, domesticated animals, and with it, a new kind of population growth. Farming supports more children. More stable food means earlier weaning, shorter birth intervals, higher survival rates. A farming community can double its population in a way hunter-gatherers rarely can. So when farmers moved into Europe, it wasn't just a cultural exchange, it was a demographic wave. They didn't need to conquer in the way we imagine conquest. They only needed to reproduce. Over centuries they expanded across the continent like a tide. They built villages, cleared forests, planted fields. They carried different genes, different immune adaptations, different diets, and often different eye color frequencies. In many places, the arrival of farmers reduced the genetic contribution of the earlier hunter-gatherers dramatically. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough to reshape the genetic landscape of Europe. This is why blue eyes appear to decline in frequency during the early Neolithic in many regions. The genes didn't vanish. The people carrying them became a smaller proportion of the population. But the story doesn't end there, because evolution has a way of preserving things invisibly. Blue eyes are largely recessive. That means you can carry the blueprint without expressing it. You can have brown eyes and still pass on the blue eye variant to your children. So even if farmers with mostly brown eyes became dominant, blue eye genes could persist like embers buried under ash. And then came the third layer, the steppe. Around 5,000 years ago, pastoralist populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe began moving west and south. These people lived with horses, cattle, wagons. They carried a genetic signature that would become foundational to many later European populations. They likely contributed heavily to the spread of Indo-European languages. They changed social structures, they changed burial practices, they changed warfare, and they mixed with both the farmers and the remaining hunter-gatherer descended populations. The result was not replacement in a simple sense. It was recombination, a massive reshuffling of ancestry that created the genetic combinations we now associate with Europe. This is where you can begin to see why blue eyes became so common in certain regions. Not because one wave alone caused it, but because multiple demographic shifts created conditions where recessive variants could re-emerge, where assortative mating could amplify certain traits, where drift in regional populations could push frequencies upward again. It's like watching a river system. A stream disappears underground, then resurfaces miles later. The water was always there, it was just hidden. Now the part that makes this truly unsettling is what it implies about our assumptions. We assume evolution is slow because we measure it in large populations over stable times, but human populations were often small, fragmented, bottlenecked by climate, disease, migration, conflict. In those conditions, genetic change can happen very quickly, not because biology speeds up, but because math does. If a population crashes to a few thousand individuals and then expands again, the genetic composition of the future depends disproportionately on who survived and who reproduced during the bottleneck. This is why the Ice Age matters so much. It wasn't just a period of cold, it was a period of repeated population contraction and expansion, refugees and re-expansions. Every contraction is a lottery, every expansion is a megaphone. This is the hidden engine of rapid evolutionary change. And it's not just eye colour. The same mechanism shaped lactose persistence, the ability to digest milk as an adult. That trait spread rapidly in certain populations after the development of dairy farming. It wasn't present in early humans. It became common in some groups because culture created a new environment where that gene became valuable. Another example is resistance to certain diseases. As agriculture and dense settlements increased, infectious diseases became more common. Immune-related genes shifted. Populations adapted, not over hundreds of thousands of years, but sometimes within a few thousand. Human evolution did not stop when we became modern. It became faster in some ways because culture created new selection pressures. Blue eyes, though, remain one of the most dramatic examples because the trait seems so useless from a survival standpoint, which means it forces us to confront a powerful truth. Evolution is not only about survival, it is also about preference, about social perception, about who is chosen, about who is desired. That might feel uncomfortable because we like to believe mate choice is purely personal, purely individual, purely free. But in aggregate, across thousands of years, individual choices create population-level patterns. A preference repeated millions of times becomes a force that can reshape the human face. And here's the part that feels like a quiet horror if you sit with it long enough. No one needed to consciously prefer blue eyes. All that was required was a slight bias, a subtle pull, a tendency to look longer, to remember, to feel something. And those tiny preferences multiplied across generations could sweep a mutation through a continent. This is what scientists mean when they say sexual selection can be runaway. It's not because it's rational, it's because it's self-reinforcing. Imagine a small population where one person has blue eyes. At first, it's rare. It stands out. People notice it. Even if they don't prefer it consciously, they may pay attention. They may remember it. They may find it intriguing. That attention can translate into social advantage. More opportunities, more mates, more children. As the trait spreads, it becomes less rare, but now it has a new power. It becomes associated with lineage, with certain families, with identity, with group belonging. People begin to notice patterns. This clan has the light eyes. That group doesn't. Whether that creates status or stigma depends on culture, but either way, it becomes meaningful, and meaning affects behavior. Behavior affects reproduction. Reproduction affects gene frequencies. This is the loop, and it doesn't require anyone to understand it. It only requires humans to be human. There's another reason eye colour might have become such a potent social marker in prehistoric Europe. In small groups, anything that helps you identify kin and allies matters. If you live in a world where groups sometimes meet peacefully and sometimes violently, recognizing who belongs to your community is not a trivial thing. We often assume ancient humans were constantly fighting. The reality is probably more subtle. There was cooperation and conflict, trade and raiding, intermarriage and rivalry. But in all of it, identity mattered. Eye colour is visible from a distance. It's difficult to fake. It's stable. In a world without surnames, without documents, without written genealogy, physical traits become a kind of social technology. Not because people consciously used them that way, but because humans naturally categorize. We create in-groups and out-groups. We map meaning onto difference. A rare eye colour could become a marker of ancestry in the same way certain patterns of jewellery or clothing might later become cultural markers. And if being part of a certain group increased survival or access to resources, even indirectly, then a trait associated with that group could become more common. Again, you don't need a direct advantage. You need a social advantage. Social advantage is one of the most powerful and underappreciated drivers of human evolution. Now let's step back into the deep time landscape again and imagine the world where the blue-eye variant first spread. You're in late Pleistocene Europe. The sky is pale. The wind cuts across open plains. Tree lines are sparse. The animals are massive. Not just reindeer, but giant bovids, woolly rhinoceroses, mammoths. Predators too, cave lions, wolves, bears. Humans survive by reading the land with precision and by cooperating intensely. In such a world, small differences in social dynamics can ripple outward. A slightly more cohesive group survives better. A group with stronger trust networks shares food more reliably. A group that can coordinate hunts more effectively feeds more children. If a visible trait becomes associated with a high-status hunter, a respected elder, a successful lineage, that trait can ride the wave of social prestige. And prestige, in evolutionary terms, is fertility. This is another uncomfortable truth. Human reproductive success is not only about physical health, it's about status, about alliances, about reputation, about desirability. Blue eyes might have become a prestige marker simply because they were rare and noticeable. or because they appeared in a lineage that happened to be successful, or because, once they became a little more common, they became associated with a group that expanded. Any of these could be true. The genetic record cannot tell us exactly which social dynamics were at play. It can only tell us the outcome, and the outcome is clear. The blue-eye haplotype spread with unusual speed. But there is another layer here, one that makes the story even more eerie, because blue eyes are not only about beauty or novelty, they are also about perception. When you look into someone's eyes, you don't just see colour, you see emotion, you see intention, you see mind. Human beings evolved to read faces, especially eyes, with extraordinary sensitivity. Our ability to interpret gaze direction, pupil dilation, micro-expressions around the eyes, is part of what makes human social complexity possible. And eye colour changes the way gaze is perceived. In lighter eyes, the contrast between pupil and iris can be more pronounced in certain lighting. Eye movements can appear sharper, more visible. Some studies suggest people perceive emotions differently depending on eye colour, even if the actual expression is the same. These are subtle effects, but in a small, intimate society, subtle effects can matter. If blue eyes made gaze easier to read, or made expressions appear more intense, or created the impression of vulnerability or innocence that could shape social response, people might trust you more, or fear you less, or feel more bonded. Again, none of this needs to be conscious. It only needs to influence behaviour slightly, because evolution amplifies slight biases across time. When you start seeing the story this way, the mystery shifts. It's no longer just, why did blue eyes spread? It becomes, how much of human evolution has been shaped by psychological preferences we barely understand? And that question doesn't stop at eye colour, it reaches into everything. Skin tone, hair texture, voice pitch, body shape, facial symmetry, even behavioural traits. Humans select each other, repeatedly, constantly, and those selections, aggregated, become biology. There's a reason this feels unsettling. Because it makes evolution feel intimate. It makes it feel like something happening in the soft space between two people looking at each other, not in the abstract harshness of predators and famine. And in a way, that's what makes humans unique. We evolved not just in response to environment, but in response to each other. We became our own selection pressure. Now, consider the timeline again, and notice how recent much of this is. 7,000 years ago, dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherers still existed in Europe. That's not ancient in evolutionary terms, that's yesterday. 5,000 years ago, the steppe migrations reshaped Europe's genetic structure. That's within the era when people were already building monumental structures in other parts of the world. The pyramids were rising in Egypt, cities were growing in Mesopotamia, written language was emerging. Meanwhile, Europe was still being demographically rewritten. This is why the modern European phenotype is not ancient, it's assembled. It's patched together from multiple ancestral sources and multiple selective pressures. Light skin became common in Europe largely after agriculture, because dietary changes reduced vitamin D intake from wild animal sources and increased reliance on grains. Under low sunlight, this created selection for lighter skin to produce vitamin D more efficiently. Blonde hair is yet another story, likely tied to variants in genes like MC1R and others, with complex selective histories that may involve sexual selection and regional drift. Blue eyes are yet another story. Modern Northern Europeans represent the convergence of these separate evolutionary threads, woven together through migration, mixing, and selection. So when people talk about European traits as if they are fixed, ancient, natural, they are misunderstanding the nature of human variation. Our traits are dynamic. They are the product of recent history, and the same forces that shaped them then are still operating now. Which brings us to the quiet, modern extension of this story. Because you might think that in an age of technology, medicine, and global culture, evolution has stopped, that we've insulated ourselves from selection pressures, that our genes no longer matter. But that isn't true. Selection pressures have changed, not disappeared. The environment is different. The pressures are different. But the fundamental mechanism, differential reproduction, still operates, and mate choice is now mediated by new systems. Social media, dating apps, globalized beauty standards, cultural narratives that spread faster than genes can. This creates a new kind of selection landscape, not one shaped only by geography and small bands, but by network effects across billions of people. It's hard to predict what that will do over thousands of years. But the Blue Eye story gives you a framework. It shows how preferences can reshape populations quickly, especially when demographic conditions align. If a certain trait becomes associated with status or desirability on a global scale, it could influence reproductive patterns. Not uniformly, not in a simple way, but enough to leave genetic fingerprints. This is not science fiction. It's a continuation of the same process. The only difference is scale, and scale is everything. In the Ice Age, small populations made drift and founder effects powerful. In the modern world, huge populations reduce drift. But global connectivity can create new kinds of selection. Cultural selection, social selection, economic selection. The traits that increase reproductive success today may not be those that increase survival. They may not even be physical. They may be behavioral, cognitive, social. The ability to navigate complex networks, the ability to gain status, the ability to find partners in an environment of choice abundance. These are pressures, real ones, and they will shape the future human species just as surely as the Ice Age shaped the past. When you look at Blue Eyes with this perspective, they become more than a curiosity. They become a symbol of how quickly the human story can change. A single mutation, a small population, a shifting climate, a wave of migration, a set of preferences, and suddenly a continent looks different. That's the real lesson. Not that Blue Eyes are special, but that human evolution is more volatile than we like to admit. It can pivot, it can sweep, it can assemble new combinations in just a few thousand years, and we're living in a time of unprecedented demographic change. Global migration mixing populations at a scale never seen before, medical technology altering survival patterns, culture reshaping preferences in real time. If you want to know what humans will look like in 10,000 years, the honest answer is we don't know, but we do know this. They will not look exactly like us. They never do. Because even when we think nothing is changing, change is happening quietly in the intimate mathematics of births, relationships, and population movement. And somewhere in that vast process, small, rare variants are appearing right now. Mutations as ordinary as the one that created Blue Eyes. Most will vanish. Some will persist. A few might explode if conditions align. That's what happened once in the cold margins of Ice Age Europe. And that is why, if you have blue eyes, or if you carry the hidden genes for them, you're not just looking at a colour. You're looking at a proof. Proof that the human story can be rewritten quickly. Proof that attraction can become a force of nature. Proof that history is not only in ruins and bones, but in the living architecture of your body. The iris is small, a thin ring of tissue, a few millimeters of colour, and yet it contains a mystery vast enough to stretch back to mammoths and ice and forgotten migrations. A mystery that reminds you, quietly, that you are not finished. Your species is not finished. Evolution is not finished. It is still moving, still selecting, still drifting, still shaping. And every time you meet someone's gaze, every time light hits an iris and scatters back into the world, you are seeing the surface of a process deeper than any civilization. A process that has been writing and rewriting the human face for hundreds of thousands of years, and will continue to do so long after this moment becomes another layer in the sediment of time. If you follow this thread far enough, it eventually stops being about blue eyes at all. Blue eyes are just the visible crack in the surface. What really matters is what that crack reveals underneath. How fragile our assumptions about normal human appearance are, and how quickly the human form can reorganize itself when history applies pressure. To see this clearly, you have to step outside the idea of identity as something fixed. Prehistoric humans did not think of themselves as belonging to races, continents, or categories that would make sense to us. They thought in terms of bands, kin, valleys, rivers, seasonal routes. Identity was local, fluid, and constantly renegotiated as groups split, merged, migrated, and vanished. This matters because genetic traits do not spread through abstract populations. They spread through real people making real decisions under specific circumstances. And those circumstances were often extreme. Ice Age Europe was not just cold, it was unstable. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Coastlines appeared and disappeared as sea levels dropped and rose. Entire ecosystems shifted over distances of hundreds of kilometers within a few generations. Animals followed the grass. Humans followed the animals. And when the animals vanished, humans vanished too. These repeated cycles of movement created a world where no population stayed isolated for very long, but no population was ever truly secure. Bands split when resources ran thin. Groups fused when survival demanded cooperation. Children grew up surrounded by people who are not all closely related to them, but who shared skills, stories, and genes. In that world, visibility mattered. Recognizability mattered. Anything that helped you stand out or helped others remember you had potential consequences far beyond appearance. Eyes are uniquely powerful in this context. They are the first thing humans look at when trying to understand another person. Long before language became fully symbolic, gaze conveyed intention, threat, interest, fear, trust. We evolved to read eyes with astonishing precision because misreading them could mean death. A slightly different eye colour changes that signal, not dramatically, not in a way that modern people notice consciously, but enough to alter perception in small cumulative ways. In a small Ice Age band of 30 people, a face with light eyes would not be lost in the crowd. It would become familiar quickly. Children would grow up associating that look with specific individuals, with specific behaviors, with specific outcomes. Over time, those associations could become expectations. This is how biology and psychology braid together, not through grand design, but through repetition. And repetition is where evolution hides. Now imagine those same bands during the long retreat of the ice sheets. Year after year, the world opens up. New valleys become habitable. New rivers appear. Game animals move north. Humans follow. Each migration event is a filter. Only some people go. Only some survive. Only some reproduce in the new territory. Every migration amplifies whatever genetic traits are present in the migrants relative to the source population. This is why expansion phases are so important in human evolution. They don't just spread people, they reshape gene frequencies. If a migrating group happened to include several blue-eyed individuals, Their descendants could dominate the gene pool of an entire region within a few centuries, simply because they arrived first and multiplied. This is not speculation. We see this exact pattern in ancient DNA. Regions that were recolonized early show stronger signals of certain hunter-gatherer lineages. Regions that were settled later show different mixes. The timing of arrival matters as much as the traits themselves. And here's where the story becomes almost uncomfortable in how modern it feels. Because once blue eyes became more common in certain regions, preference could shift from novelty to familiarity. Humans tend to choose partners who resemble those around them. This is not about conscious bias. It's about cognitive comfort. Familiar features feel safer, more predictable, more trustworthy. This is assortative mating. It sounds technical, but it's deeply human. People pair with people who look like the people they grew up with. Once blue eyes reached a certain frequency in a population, they could become self-reinforcing, not because they were rare, but because there's a normal. Children raised in blue-eyed communities would later choose blue-eyed partners at slightly higher rates, not out of ideology, but out of familiarity. Small biases again, amplified over generations. This is how traits lock in, and this is why blue eyes did not simply rise and fall once. They surged, receded, and surged again, depending on which populations were expanding and which were contracting. The Neolithic farmers changed the balance. Agriculture created denser populations. Denser populations reduce the power of drift. In large populations, random chance loses influence. Selection has to work harder to move gene frequencies. This is why many hunter-gatherer traits declined during the early farming period. Not because they were inferior, but because they were numerically overwhelmed. But farming introduced new pressures, diet changed radically. People consumed more grains, fewer wild animals, fewer vitamin D-rich foods. Sunlight became a limiting factor. Suddenly skin pigmentation mattered more than it ever had before. Light skin did provide a real survival advantage in northern latitudes under agricultural diets. Individuals with lighter skin could synthesize vitamin D more efficiently in low UV environments, reducing the risk of bone deformities, immune dysfunction, and reproductive complications. This selection pressure was strong, and it acted on different genes than eye color. So for thousands of years, Europe moved through a strange phase where skin color was under strong natural selection, while eye color was shaped mostly by demographic history and social preference. This created combinations that feel counterintuitive today. Dark skin with blue eyes, light skin with brown eyes, blonde hair with dark eyes. These were not anomalies. They were transitional states. What we consider normal now is the result of these independent trajectories converging late. This is why ancient DNA has been so destabilizing. It doesn't just fill gaps, it rearranges our sense of continuity. It shows that the past was not populated by earlier versions of us, but by people who look genuinely different in ways that don't map cleanly onto modern categories. And that realization leads to an even deeper implication. If physical appearance can change this quickly, then cultural assumptions about what is natural are deeply unreliable. We tend to treat visible traits as timeless markers, as if eye color or skin tone has always meant the same thing, as if they define deep, ancient divisions. The genetic record says otherwise. It shows that many traits we load with meaning are recent, contingent, and accidental. They are not destiny. They are history, and history moves. Now step forward again into the Bronze Age, when Europe undergoes one of its most profound transformations. Steppe populations bring horses, wheels, new weapons, new burial rites, new languages. They change how people move, how they fight, how they organize society. This is not just a cultural shift, it's a demographic earthquake. Ancient DNA shows that in many regions, steppe ancestry makes up a large fraction of the genetic makeup of later populations. This is especially true in northern and central Europe, and this is where blue eyes surge again. Not necessarily because the steppe populations all had blue eyes, but because the mixing of populations created new combinations and re-exposed recessive variants that had been hidden. Recessive traits behave strangely in expanding populations. They can remain invisible for generations, then suddenly appear when two carriers meet. In a rapidly growing, mixing population, those meetings become more common. Once visible again, preference can act, and preference is relentless. This second surge of blue eyes likely had a different social context than the first. This was not a world of small bands scraping out survival at the edge of ice. This was a world of emerging hierarchies, warrior elites, long-distance networks, and symbolic status. Eye colour could take on new meanings in this context. Lineage markers, group identity, status association. None of this requires formal ideology. It only requires pattern recognition and social learning. Children notice which families have power. They notice which traits are associated with success. They internalize those patterns without understanding them. This is how culture feeds back into biology. And by the time written history begins in Europe, much of this process is already complete. The classical Greeks encounter populations whose physical appearance already reflects thousands of years of mixing and selection. The Romans record peoples with light eyes in the north, darker eyes in the south. But they are seeing the end state, not the process. They do not know that blue eyes once dominated dark-skinned hunter-gatherers. They do not know that light skin is younger than agriculture. They do not know that most of what they see is recent, and neither do we until now. The blue eye story forces a recalibration of how we think about time. 10,000 years feels ancient to us, but genetically it's nothing. It's a handful of generations multiplied by favourable conditions. Human evolution is not slow when populations are small, mobile, and under shifting pressures. It's fast. It's volatile, and it can reverse direction. This brings us to the present moment, where the conditions shaping human evolution are changing again. Modern populations are enormous, billions of people. This dampens drift. Founder effects still happen, but mostly in isolated communities. However, migration is now global. Populations mix across continents in ways that were impossible in the past. Cultural preferences spread instantly through media. Beauty standards become international. This creates a new evolutionary environment, one that does not resemble the Ice Age, the Neolithic, or the Bronze Age. Some selection pressures weaken, others intensify. Traits that once mattered for survival matter less. Traits that matter for social navigation may matter more. This does not mean evolution has stopped, it means it has changed shape. Blue eyes may no longer be under strong selection globally, but other traits could be, not necessarily physical ones, behavioral traits, cognitive traits, emotional traits. Evolution does not care what we value, it responds to what reproduces, and reproduction is influenced by attraction, opportunity, and social structure. The blue eye mutation is a reminder that the human genome is not sacred or static. It is responsive, it bends, it flows. It also reminds us that evolution does not optimize for truth or fairness or meaning, it optimizes for continuation. If a trait helps a lineage persist, even indirectly it can spread. If it doesn't, it disappears. This is neither cruel nor kind, it simply is. When you step back far enough, the story of blue eyes becomes a parable about scale. At the level of an individual, a mutation is meaningless. At the level of a small group, it's curiosity. At the level of a continent over thousands of years, it becomes destiny. And that scale shift is where most misunderstandings arise. We judge the past through the lens of the present, forgetting that people lived in worlds structured very differently from ours. Their choices made sense in their context. Their preferences reflected their environment, and those preferences left marks we still carry. If you have blue eyes, or if you carry the hidden genes for them, you're not an anomaly. You're a document, a living record of migrations, bottlenecks, expansions, attractions, and accidents. Your eyes are not just yours, they're a story that survived, a story written not in ink or stone, but in collagen fibers and light scattering, and a broken genetic switch that refused to stay hidden. And the most unsettling part is not that this happened once, it's that it can happen again. Because evolution is not finished. It is patient, it waits for conditions, and when they align it moves faster than we expect, quietly, invisibly, until one day the mirror looks different, and we realize too late that the change has already spread. When you slow this all the way down and really let it settle, what becomes clear is that blue eyes are not an anomaly in human evolution. They are an example, a visible case study of how quickly the human species can reorganize itself when circumstances align. And once you see that, you start noticing the same pattern everywhere you look in our deep past. Human evolution does not move like a straight river. It moves like braided streams, channels splitting, merging, disappearing underground, re-emerging somewhere else entirely. Traits don't march forward in neat lines. They flicker, they surge, they vanish, they return, sometimes stronger than before. This is why the archaeological and genetic record can feel so disorienting. We want continuity. We want clean narratives. We want the past to look like an early draft of the present. But that's not what it was. The past was stranger, more fluid, more unstable than we are comfortable admitting, and eye colour just happens to be one of the few traits where the evidence is so clear, so dramatic, that we can't ignore it. But to truly understand the scale of what happened, you have to confront another uncomfortable reality. For most of human history, extinction was the default outcome. Not just for animals, but for human groups as well. Most human populations that ever existed are gone. Not assimilated, not transformed. Gone. Their genes vanished. Their languages vanished. Their stories vanished. Their faces vanished. Their preferences vanished. They left no descendants, no memory, no trace we can recover. When you look at it this way, the survival of any lineage at all is extraordinary. The survival of a single mutation across 35,000 years is almost miraculous, and yet it happened. Because survival is not about strength or intelligence alone. It's about position in time, about being present when expansion happens and absent when collapse comes. This is the deeper lesson hidden inside the blue eye story. Evolution does not reward the best traits. It rewards the traits that happen to be carried by the survivors of bottlenecks. Every ice age, every drought, every epidemic, every migration wave is a genetic filter. Most variation is lost. What remains becomes the foundation of the future. This is why ancient human history is filled with sudden discontinuities. Entire cultures disappear not because they were inferior, but because they were unlucky. Because their refugees failed, because their routes closed, because the climate shifted a few degrees too far. And when those disappearances happen, the genetic story resets around whoever is left. Blue eyes survived because their carriers survived. Not because blue eyes were special, because the people carrying them found themselves in the right places when the world opened up again. Now consider how often this happened. The last ice age was not a single event. It was a long oscillation, cold phases, slight warmings, cold again, over tens of thousands of years. Each oscillation pushed human populations south, then allowed them to creep north again. Each movement reshuffled genes, each contraction amplified drift, each expansion magnified founder effects. This repeated cycle created ideal conditions for rapid genetic change. Modern humans have never experienced anything like it. We live in a relatively stable climatic period. The Holocene, agriculture, cities, global trade, all of it depends on that stability. But stability dampens evolution. It smooths variation. It preserves existing structures. Instability, by contrast, accelerates change. And Ice Age Europe was nothing but instability. Now imagine what it felt like to live in that world. No calendars, no forecasts, no long-term guarantees. The landscape itself was unreliable. Rivers shifted, coastlines moved, forests appeared and disappeared. Animals migrated unpredictably. In such a world, adaptability was everything. But adaptability does not always mean biological adaptation. Often it means social adaptation, who you ally with, who you trust, who you choose to reproduce with. And those decisions, repeated thousands of times, leave marks in the genome. This is where the story begins to intersect with something deeper than genetics. It intersects with human psychology. Because humans are not neutral selectors. We do not choose randomly. We're influenced by beauty, novelty, familiarity, status, emotion, story. And those influences are ancient. The same cognitive machinery that makes you notice someone's eyes today existed tens of thousands of years ago. It evolved to help us navigate complex social environments, to assess intention, to judge safety, to predict behavior. That machinery doesn't care whether its outputs are evolutionarily optimal. It responds to stimuli. Blue eyes were a stimulus. They broke pattern. They created contrast. They drew attention. And attention is currency in a small group. Now layer this over the demographic reality again. Small populations, high mortality, short life expectancy, high variance in reproductive success. In such conditions, even small differences in attractiveness can have enormous effects. If one person has twice as many surviving children as another, their genetic contribution doubles in a single generation. Multiply that across a few centuries, and you get dramatic shifts. This is why evolutionary change can appear sudden in the archaeological record. It isn't that biology suddenly sped up. It's that demographic mathematics took over. And that brings us to something we rarely talk about, honestly. The role of inequality in evolution. Not social inequality in the modern sense, but reproductive inequality. In many ancient societies, a small number of individuals contributed disproportionately to the gene pool. Successful hunters, charismatic leaders, individuals with access to resources or alliances. This uneven reproduction amplifies selection. Traits associated with high-status individuals spread faster, even if those traits are neutral or mildly disadvantageous biologically. If blue eyes became associated with certain successful lineages, whether through chance, founder effects, or early prestige, then they could ride that inequality into dominance. This is not speculation. Genetic studies show that many populations have skewed ancestry, where a small fraction of individuals account for a large fraction of descendants. The Y chromosome evidence from steppe migrations is a famous example, where a few male lineages spread explosively across Eurasia. Human history is full of genetic bottlenecks created not just by climate or disease, but by social structure. and blue eyes may have benefited from that dynamic more than once. What makes this unsettling is that it reframes how we think about choice. The people involved were not choosing to reshape Europe's genetic future. They were choosing partners, allies, mates, within the constraints of their world. The consequences emerged later, at scales no individual could perceive. This is the recurring theme of human history. Local decisions, global consequences. Now consider how this story interacts with the idea of race, a concept that collapses completely under genetic scrutiny. If blue eyes could spread through dark-skinned populations and later become associated with light skin through entirely separate processes, then visible traits cannot be reliable markers of deep ancestry. They are snapshots, not lineages. The genetic reality is far messier. Most variation exists within populations, not between them. Traits assort and recombine. Features we treat as linked are often independent. This is why ancient DNA keeps surprising us. It doesn't just fill gaps, it overturns intuition. People who lived in Europe 10,000 years ago would not fit into modern racial categories, not because they were in between, but because the categories themselves are modern inventions imposed on a past that didn't conform to them. Blue eyes expose that illusion brutally. They show how a trait we associate with a particular group can have an origin story that cuts across everything we think it should align with, and once you accept that, you're forced to accept something else. The future will not preserve today's categories either. Just as the people of the Upper Paleolithic could not imagine the phenotype of modern Europeans, we cannot imagine what humans will look like in 10 or 20,000 years. Not because it's unknowable in principle, but because too many variables are in play. Climate, migration, technology, culture, selection, chance, all interacting. And blue eyes remind us that chance plays a larger role than we like to admit. The mutation that created blue eyes was not inevitable. It was a mistake, a broken switch, a failure of melanin production in the iris. Most such mutations disappear. This one didn't. Not because it was perfect, but because the world it appeared in was small, unstable, and primed for amplification. Now think about the present. We live in the largest population humanity has ever seen. Over 8 billion people. This reduces the power of random drift globally, but it does not eliminate it locally. Small populations still exist, isolated communities, cultural enclaves, founder effects still occur. More importantly, selection pressures have shifted. Survival is no longer the primary filter in many places. Medicine, infrastructure, and social systems buffer against environmental threats. But reproduction is still unequal, still patterned, still influenced by preference and opportunity. And preference is increasingly shaped by global media. This introduces a new kind of evolutionary force, cultural amplification at planetary scale. Traits associated with desirability can spread socially faster than genes. But social spread influences mating patterns, and mating patterns influence genes. This feedback loop is new, and we do not yet understand its long-term consequences. Blue eyes spread because of local novelty and demographic conditions. Future traits may spread because of global narratives. That is a profound shift. It means that human evolution may become increasingly detached from environment and increasingly tied to culture. But culture is volatile. What is desirable now may not be desirable later. This creates oscillations. Traits could rise and fall in frequency over relatively short periods, driven not by climate or survival, but by shifting social values. In evolutionary terms, this is unprecedented, and yet the blue eye story tells us it is possible. Because the underlying mechanism, differential reproduction driven by preference, has always been there. Only the scale has changed. There is one more layer to this story that deserves attention, because it ties everything together. Memory. Not genetic memory, but cultural memory. When civilizations rise and fall, when populations shift and mix, memory fractures, stories get lost, explanations disappear, people forget why things are the way they are. Eye colour is one of those things we rarely question. It feels static, given, natural, but it isn't. It is the residue of forgotten histories, forgotten migrations, forgotten bottlenecks, forgotten preferences. The blue-eye mutation survived not just because it was carried forward biologically, but because nothing ever happened that selected strongly against it. It slipped through history unnoticed, accumulating presence while meaning drained away. By the time people began writing history, blue eyes were already common in parts of Europe. There was no memory of their origin, no myth explaining them, no awareness that they were new. They simply were. And that is how most evolutionary change feels from the inside. Silent, gradual, unremarkable. Until someone looks back and realizes how different things used to be. Ancient DNA has given us that backward glance. It has shown us that the human story is not one of slow refinement, but of repeated reinvention. Blue eyes are one chapter in that story, not the most important, but one of the clearest, because they remind us that even something as intimate as the colour of your eyes is not personal in the way we think it is. It is communal, historical, collective. It is the echo of people you will never know, living in worlds you cannot imagine, making choices that felt ordinary to them but became extraordinary to us. And the unsettling truth is that the same is true of you. Your preferences, your choices, your attractions, they feel personal, they feel private, but multiplied across millions of people and thousands of years, they become forces. Forces that shape what survives, what spreads, what disappears. The people of Ice Age Europe did not know they were participating in an evolutionary experiment that would reshape an entire continent's appearance. They were just living. And that is the final, quiet power of the Blue Eye story. It doesn't tell us what will happen next. It tells us that something will. Because as long as humans exist, evolution does not stop. It just waits for the next small mutation, the next bottleneck, the next expansion, the next preference. And when the conditions align, it moves again, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively, leaving behind a new normal that future generations will mistake for permanence until they look back and realize how wrong that assumption always was. If you sit with this long enough, a strange reversal happens. What began as a story about a mutation in the eye becomes a story about how little control humans have over their own future shape, not because we are powerless, but because the forces that shape us operate at scales we rarely perceive. Evolution does not announce itself. It does not arrive with milestones or warnings. It works quietly through probabilities, through repetition, through outcomes that only make sense in retrospect. Blue eyes did not feel revolutionary when they first appeared. They did not feel meaningful. They were just there, a slightly different way light reflected off a human face. And yet, that difference was enough. The deeper you go into the genetic record, the more you realize how often this happens. Not just with eye color, but with countless traits that rise, fall, and vanish without ceremony. Most leave no visible trace. Blue eyes are unusual only because they are easy to see. They glow back at us from the past. But imagine how many other traits followed similar paths and disappeared before they could become visible. Variations in metabolism, pain sensitivity, disease resistance, personality tendencies, cognitive biases, emotional thresholds. Many of these traits are shaped by dozens or hundreds of genes interacting with environment. They rise and fall quietly, blending into the background of human diversity. We only notice the survivors. This creates a powerful illusion. We look at the present and assume it represents a stable endpoint. We assume that the traits we see around us must have been favored for good reasons, that they are optimal, that they are somehow inevitable. The blue eye story destroys that illusion. It shows that a trait can spread explosively without helping survival, without improving intelligence, without increasing strength. It only has to align with circumstance. This is uncomfortable because it undermines one of our favourite stories about ourselves, the story that we are the product of relentless optimization, that evolution carved us into our current form because it was the best possible solution. The truth is messier. We are not optimized. We are contingent. We are what happened to survive, and what survived was often shaped as much by chance as by necessity. Consider again the scale of loss behind every surviving lineage. Every modern human carries DNA from a tiny fraction of all humans who ever lived. The rest left no genetic descendants. Their traits vanished. Their bodies returned to the earth. Their existence ended without echo. This means that the present is not representative of the past. It is a narrow funnel, a compressed remnant. Blue eyes made it through that funnel. Countless other variations did not. And the reason blue eyes made it through was not because they were superior, but because the people who carried them passed through bottlenecks that erased alternatives. This reframes survival itself. Survival is not about excellence. It is about continuity, about being carried forward through disruption. And disruption was the rule, not the exception, in human prehistory. The Ice Age ended. The climate warmed. Sea levels rose. Coastlines flooded. Entire landscapes vanished beneath water. Populations that had lived on those lands for thousands of years were displaced or drowned. One of those submerged landscapes was Doggerland, a vast plain connecting Britain to continental Europe. Tens of thousands of people lived there. They hunted, gathered, raised children, buried their dead. Then the sea rose. Doggerland disappeared. So did most of its people. Those who survived fled to higher ground, carrying with them whatever genes they happened to possess. Those genes multiplied. Others were lost forever. This happened again and again across the globe. Rivers shifted, deserts expanded, forests collapsed, volcanoes erupted, diseases spread. Human history is written in absences. Blue eyes are present because something else is missing. This is why the story feels haunting when you really absorb it, because it forces you to acknowledge how much of humanity is gone, how little of it made it to now, and how arbitrary that survival often was. The people who carried the blue-eye mutation did not know they were special. They did not know they were rare. They did not know their genes would matter. They were born into families, they learned to hunt, they fell in love, they aged, they died. Their significance emerged later, long after intention was gone. This is the final lesson hidden inside the science. Meaning is retrospective. Evolution does not care about meaning, but humans do. We look backward and try to impose coherence on outcomes that were never planned. We want stories with causes and effects. We want to believe that what exists now exists for a reason. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it exists because it was carried through chaos. Blue eyes survived chaos. That is their only true advantage. When you strip away the romance, the genetics, the anthropology, what remains is a quiet truth. The future is always built from whatever fragments the past fails to destroy. And those fragments are not chosen. They are selected by circumstance. This understanding should humble us, not in a pessimistic way, but in a clarifying one. It tells us that our current form is temporary, that our traits, our appearances, our assumptions are not fixed points but snapshots. The humans of the future will look back at us the way we look back at the Ice Age hunters, with curiosity, with misunderstanding, with surprise. They will see traits we consider normal as transitional. They will see patterns we cannot yet recognize. And they will build stories to explain how those traits came to be. Some of those stories will be wrong, some will be incomplete, some will be corrected by evidence we cannot yet imagine. That is the continuity. Blue eyes are not the end of the story. They are a reminder that stories never end. They only pause at the present. As you drift towards sleep, let this settle not as a fact, but as a perspective. You're not just an individual living in a moment. You're a temporary arrangement of ancient decisions, ancient movements, ancient accidents. Your face is a fossil in motion. Your eyes are light passing through history. And somewhere, far back in time, someone who looked nothing like you lived a life that made your existence possible. They did not know you were coming. They did not know what they were passing on. They only knew their own moment. Just as you only know yours, that is how evolution works. Quietly, blindly, relentlessly. Not toward perfection, but toward continuation. And blue eyes, staring back at us from the present, are proof that even the smallest deviation can echo for tens of thousands of years if history allows it to pass through. So rest with that thought, not with answers, but with awareness, that you are part of a process far older than memory, far larger than intention, and far from finished. The story that shaped your eyes is still shaping the world, and long after we are gone it will continue, unnoticed, until someone looks back and wonders how it all began.